He survived 2 world wars, bullets, bombs, and some of the most ferocious battles the 20th century ever produced. He was feared by his enemies, revered by his men, and considered by many, on both sides of the Atlantic, to be the greatest battlefield commander America had ever produced. And then, on a quiet Sunday morning in Germany, with the war already over and Christmas just 2 weeks away, it all came apart on a stretch of road outside Mannheim. What happened in the 12 days that followed is a story most people have never heard in full, and it is far more harrowing and far more complicated than a simple car accident. To understand the final chapter of George Patton's life, you first have to understand how thoroughly the peace had already begun to destroy him. Germany surrendered on May 8, 1945. For most Americans, it was the moment the world finally exhaled. For Patton, it was something closer to a sentence. He had spent the better part of 30 years preparing for this kind of war, and now it was over. When news came that Japan had surrendered that August, ending the last remaining theater of combat, Patton wrote in his diary that another war had come to an end, and with it, his usefulness to the world. He was not being dramatic. He genuinely meant it. He had been appointed military governor of Bavaria, a political role that required patience, diplomacy, and a tolerance for bureaucracy. Patton had none of these things. He was a man built for movement, for decision, for the sharp clarity of battle. Overseeing denazification paperwork and civilian administration was, to his mind, a slow form of suffocation. He clashed almost immediately with Allied policy, and those clashes would prove costly. The core of his disagreement was not trivial. Patton had watched the Soviet Union absorb Eastern Europe in the wake of the German defeat, and he had become convinced, well before most of his contemporaries, that the Soviets represented the next great threat to the Western world. He said so, loudly and repeatedly, to anyone who would listen and to many who wished he wouldn't. He argued that the American military was still intact, still strong, and that the time to press the point was now, before the Iron Curtain could be drawn permanently across the continent. His superiors, including General Dwight Eisenhower, were not interested in that argument. The war had just ended. The public had no appetite for another one, and Patton's outspokenness was becoming a diplomatic liability. The moment that ended his command in Bavaria came at a press conference on September 22, 1945. Patton was defending his use of former Nazi Party members in administrative positions. A practical decision, he argued, since so many ordinary Germans had been compelled to join the party simply to keep their jobs. But his handling of the press conference was disastrous. He compared the controversy over Nazism to a dispute between Democrats and Republicans, a comparison so tone-deaf, given the scale of what the Nazi regime had done, that the backlash was immediate and severe. Eisenhower relieved him of command within days. His new assignment was to head the 15th Army at Bad Nauheim, a headquarters in name only, whose primary task was writing the official history of the European campaign. Patton described the role as serving as an undertaker at my own funeral. He had roughly 400 officers and 3,000 men under his command, most of them clerks. His brilliant career had effectively been reduced to a filing operation. And yet, characteristically, Patton threw himself into even this. He drove the historians under his command to finish their reports, reportedly completing the task in a fraction of the expected time. He traveled across Europe, visiting old battlefields and meeting with former allies. He went to Stockholm to reunite with fellow athletes from the 1912 Olympics, where he had competed in the modern pentathlon. He was trying, in whatever way he could, to keep moving, to stay useful, to avoid the stillness that frightened him more than any German tank formation ever had. By early December 1945, he had made up his mind. He would fly home for Christmas on December 10th, meet with Beatrice, and decide whether to accept a stateside posting or retire from the army altogether. He was 60 years old. He was tired in a way that had nothing to do with physical exhaustion. He had one day left before the flight. He decided to spend it pheasant hunting. What happened next would change everything. And it began as the most ordinary kind of Sunday morning imaginable. A hunting trip, an open road, a Cadillac heading toward the Mannheim countryside, and a single turn that no one, not Patton, not his driver, not anyone in that vehicle, would see coming in time to do anything about it. Around 9 o'clock on the morning of December 9th, 1945, Patton climbed into the back of his 1938 Cadillac Model 75, a long, elegant staff car that had carried him across the theater of war in Europe. Sitting beside him in the back seat was his chief of staff, Major General Hobart Hap Gay. Behind them, trailing in a jeep driven by Technical Sergeant Joe Spruce, were the general's rifles and a hunting dog. Patton's regular driver, Sergeant Mims, had already rotated back to the United States. The man behind the wheel that morning was Private First Class Horace Woodring, 19 years old, from Kentucky, who had been Patton's chauffeur for the previous 4 months. The plan was simple: drive to the area near Mannheim, do some pheasant hunting, take in the countryside, and return in time to pack for the flight home. The two vehicles made their way along the Autobahn, then detoured near Bad Homburg, so Patton could inspect the ruins of a Roman fort in the Taunus Mountains. A detour that was entirely typical of the man, always drawn to the traces of ancient warriors. He tramped around in the snow and got his boots and socks soaked. He was in good spirits, apparently, talking, looking out the window at the demolished landscape of post-war Germany. They turned onto National Route 38 and headed toward the northern outskirts of Mannheim. The roads in that area were lined with the wreckage of the war, piled up debris, damaged structures, the visible residue of years of bombardment. The city of Mannheim itself had been heavily bombed during the conflict, and the landscape through which the Cadillac was moving was a patchwork of industrial buildings and destruction. Patton was looking out the side window, commenting on the condition of the ruins as they passed when the Cadillac approached an intersection near a quartermaster depot. It was just past noon. The intersection was unremarkable, a road crossing where a U.S. Army supply depot sat behind a low entrance. At that moment, a U.S. Army 2.5-ton GMC truck, traveling in the opposite direction, began making a left turn toward the depot entrance. Woodring had no time to react. The truck turned directly across their path. The collision was low speed. The truck was moving slowly as it made the turn. But the physics of what happened inside the Cadillac were devastating. There were no seatbelts in the vehicle, which was standard for the era. Patton, who had been looking sideways out the window, had not braced himself. Gay and Woodring, positioned facing forward, had seen the truck appear and instinctively tensed for impact. Patton had not. He was thrown violently forward, his head striking the metal frame of the glass partition that separated the front and rear seats of the Cadillac with tremendous force, and then thrown back again into his seat. Gay and Woodring were shaken but uninjured. The hunting dog in the trailing jeep apparently bolted from the scene entirely. Patton was bleeding heavily from a severe gash to his head and began telling Gay, in a tone that those present later described as carrying more clarity than alarm, that he believed he was paralyzed. He asked Gay to rub his fingers. When Gay did, Patton told him to keep going, to work his fingers, testing for sensation that was simply no longer reaching his hands. It was not there. The scene at the roadside was initially treated by arriving military police as a minor traffic incident. Lieutenant Joseph Shanahan, a former provost marshal of Patton's Third Army who was at the scene, later said that no one initially understood how serious Patton's injuries were. The visible damage to the vehicles was not dramatic. The general was conscious and talking. No one yet appreciated what had happened to his spine. An ambulance eventually arrived, and Patton was loaded in. He was conscious, bleeding, and aware enough of his own condition to say quietly that this was a terrible way to die. He was transported to the 131st Station Hospital in Heidelberg, approximately 15 miles away, where he arrived at 12:45 in the afternoon. His pulse rate was 45. His blood pressure was 86/60. He was paralyzed from the neck down. X-rays confirmed what the examining doctors already feared. 2 cervical vertebrae, the third and fourth, had been fractured and dislocated. The spinal cord itself had been severely compressed. George Patton had broken his neck. The 131st Station Hospital in Heidelberg was not the kind of place a 4-star general was supposed to end up. It was a working military hospital, functional and stripped of any pretense. Patton was taken to Ward A1 and placed immediately in spinal traction, a procedure designed to stabilize the damaged vertebrae by applying controlled tension to the spine and preventing further displacement. The specifics of that traction are difficult to read about even now. Fishhooks were inserted into his cheeks on either side of his upper jaw. attached to weights that hung over the edges of the hospital bed. The mechanism kept his head and neck in a fixed position, preventing any movement that might worsen the injury to his spinal cord. He lay there, flat on his back, completely immobilized, able to speak and think, but unable to move his body below the neck. An armed military policeman stood guard outside his room around the clock. The MP was not there to protect Patton from any threat of violence. He was there because hundreds of journalists had descended on the hospital the moment word of the accident spread. Reporters posed as patients and orderlies. Some attempted to obtain photographs through windows. Others were caught inside the building, trying to reach the ward. The thought of anyone entering his room to photograph him in that condition was, by several accounts, deeply distressing to a man who had spent his entire career constructing and projecting an image of absolute physical power. The general who had reviewed troops from the front of a tank, who had marched through cities in polished boots and ivory-handled revolvers, now lay motionless with metal hooks through his face, unable to lift his own hand. Word reached Beatrice Eyre Patton in Boston within hours of the accident. She flew to Germany immediately, arriving at the hospital to find her husband guarded, immobilized, and, despite the fishhooks and the traction and the paralysis, characteristically composed on the surface. She later told those around her that she had seen him in difficult situations before, and he always came through. But the doctors read a different message in her demeanor. She took command of the room the moment she arrived. She requested his personal library be brought so she could read to him. She asked for strict control over who could enter his room. She insisted the doctors tell her the full truth about her husband's condition at all times, whatever that truth might be. These were not the requests of a woman who expected a simple recovery. The early prognosis was not entirely without hope. The spinal cord appeared to be injured, but not entirely severed, which left some possibility of partial recovery. Patton was alert and could speak. He received messages from well-wishers and dignitaries across the world and had them read aloud. He talked at length with his neurosurgeon, Captain William Duane, Jr., about the first anniversary of the Battle of the Bulge, which fell during those December days in the hospital. He was told plainly that he would never ride a horse again and would likely never resume any normal physical activity. He absorbed that information without obvious collapse, maintaining, as he always had, a performance of toughness even when the audience was only the people closest to him. But Beatrice, who had been married to him for 35 years and knew him more completely than anyone alive, was not persuaded by the performance. She saw through it. His daughter Ruth Ellen later said that both of her parents understood what was coming, even though they never spoke of it to each other directly. There was an unspoken agreement between them to keep moving through the days, to read books and receive letters and talk about old campaigns without naming what both of them knew. By December 20th, 11 days after the accident, the doctors had placed him in a body cast as a cautious sign of progress, with the hope that he might eventually be stabilized enough to be flown back to the United States. That hope was short-lived. On the afternoon of December 20th, while Beatrice was reading to him, Patton suddenly interrupted her. He was struggling for air. His lips had turned blue. The medical team administered oxygen, and he steadied. But what he coughed up in that moment was tinged with blood. It was an unmistakable sign. A pulmonary embolism had already struck his upper right lung. A blood clot, formed in his immobile and paralyzed body, had begun its work. Beatrice stayed with him through the rest of that day, watching. Colonel Sperling, the neurosurgeon who had been overseeing the case from the beginning, said she had been almost clairvoyant throughout the hospitalization, sensing shifts in Patton's condition before the instruments confirmed them, anticipating changes that the medical staff sometimes noticed only afterward. She was an extraordinary woman in an extraordinary situation, and she sat in that hospital room and held it together for 12 days straight. The following afternoon, December 21st, she spent most of her time at his side. When he finally fell asleep at around 5:15 in the evening, she stepped out briefly to eat her supper. She never made it back in time. At 5:55 in the evening on December 21st, 1945, the winter solstice, the shortest and darkest day of the year, General George Smith Patton, Jr. died in his sleep. A blood clot, formed in his paralyzed and immobile body, had traveled to his heart and stopped it. He did not struggle. He did not wake. He simply stopped breathing, quietly, in a hospital bed in Heidelberg, Germany. The official cause of death was recorded as pulmonary edema and congestive heart failure, the result of the embolism that had been building in his damaged body across 12 days of immobility. Captain Duane ran to the officers' mess and called for Beatrice. She had just left. She ran back across the snow-covered courtyard to Ward A1. By the time she arrived, he was already gone. He was 60 years old. He had survived the punitive expedition into Mexico in 1916, the trenches of World War I, the deserts of North Africa, the mountains of Sicily, the hedgerows of France, the frozen forests of the Ardennes, and a dozen close calls with enemy fire across 2 global conflicts. He was killed by a slow-moving army supply truck turning into a depot on a quiet Sunday morning, less than 7 months after Germany surrendered. The irony was not lost on anyone. Patton himself had once spoken plainly about the idea that a soldier's death in battle was, in some sense, appropriate, that to die in bed was a disgrace unworthy of a warrior. He died in a bed, in a hospital, 12 days after a low-speed collision with one of his own country's trucks. It was precisely the kind of ending he would have found most difficult to accept. His body was moved on December 22nd to Villa Régnier, a 19th-century mansion on a hill overlooking Heidelberg and the Neckar River, where it lay in state for 2 days, draped with his personal 4-star flag. Friends, fellow officers, soldiers, and members of the German public who had watched him drive their country to defeat came to pay their respects. The lines outside stretched long into the cold December evenings. On December 23rd, the casket was placed on an M3 half-track, a military vehicle, not a hearse, and carried through the streets of Heidelberg to the Episcopalian Christ Church for a short funeral service. There were no eulogies by design. Thousands of soldiers and German civilians lined the route to watch the procession pass. Some climbed onto rooftops for a clearer view of the flag-draped gunmetal casket as it rolled by. Patton had told Beatrice before he died that he did not want either Eisenhower or General Bedell Smith at his funeral. That wish was honored. The French government offered to bury him in Napoleon's tomb in Paris, a mark of the extraordinary esteem in which liberated France held him. Beatrice initially wanted him returned to the United States and buried near their home in Massachusetts, but Major General Jeffrey Keyes, one of Patton's oldest and most trusted subordinates, gently made a different suggestion. Beatrice considered it for a moment, and then said simply that of course that was where he should be. She didn't know why she hadn't thought of it herself. She said George would want to lie beside the men of his army who had fallen. He was buried on Christmas Eve, 1945, at the Luxembourg American Cemetery and Memorial near Ham, in the ground where more than 5,000 of his Third Army soldiers had been laid to rest after the Battle of the Bulge. The ceremony lasted 25 minutes. A 12-man squad fired 3 volleys of salutes into the Luxembourg hills. A bugler played taps. Master Sergeant William G. Meeks, the man who had served as Patton's personal orderly since April 1942, presented Beatrice with the flag that had covered the casket. There were tears in his eyes, his grave face as those of the men he commanded. As the National World War II Museum put it, he is oriented as if leading them still. One last time, into one last battle. The official verdict was clear: an accident, a broken neck, a blood clot, and death. The Army investigated and found no evidence of foul play. Beatrice herself declined an autopsy when it was offered, stating she was satisfied with the medical account and with the Army's conclusion that nothing criminal had occurred. In the years that followed, she would say, with visible frustration, that she grew deeply irritated by people who continued to insist her husband had been murdered. She had been there. She had spoken to the doctors daily for 12 days. She had watched her husband die. She did not need other people's theories. And yet, the questions did not entirely disappear, for reasons that were not entirely without basis. The circumstances around the accident had certain peculiarities that attracted attention at the time. Patton's regular driver, Sergeant Mims, who had chauffeured him through the entire European campaign, had already rotated back to the United States. His replacement was a 19-year-old private with limited experience. The accident itself was never subjected to a full formal military investigation in the immediate aftermath, in part because no one at the scene expected the injuries to be fatal. One witness, a former provost marshal of Patton's Third Army, who was present at the scene, later said that by the time military police arrived, they considered it a routine traffic matter. No court-martial was convened. The driver of the army truck was never charged with any offense. The accident reports that did exist contained inconsistencies, minor discrepancies in the positions of the vehicles, and the sequence of events that were never fully reconciled. Several witnesses either provided conflicting accounts or were difficult to locate in the days that followed. None of this, in isolation, amounts to evidence of anything beyond the ordinary confusion that surrounds any serious accident that was initially treated as trivial. But Patton was not an ordinary man, and he had not been living an ordinary life in the months before his death. He had been making enemies. The Soviets had reason to view him as a threat to post-war arrangements. He had been openly advocating for a confrontational posture toward Moscow at a time when Stalin's influence was extending across Eastern Europe unchecked. His own government had silenced him once already by removing him from Bavaria. There were figures in Allied command circles who found his outspokenness damaging to diplomatic efforts. Whether any of these tensions translated into something deliberate is a question that has never been definitively answered. In October 1979, a former American intelligence operative named Douglas Bazata publicly stated that he had been contracted to arrange Patton's death and that the truck collision had been deliberately engineered. His claims attracted mainstream press coverage and were taken seriously enough to require a response from military historians. They were also widely challenged. No physical evidence, no corroborating documentation, and no independent witness has ever emerged to support Bazata's account. Most historians who have examined the full record, including the original accident reports, hospital files, and eyewitness testimony, conclude that the accident was exactly what it appeared to be at the time, a tragic low-speed collision on a cold December morning with consequences no one could have anticipated. Modern medicine adds one final dimension to the story. Physicians who have reviewed Patton's hospital records note that the pulmonary embolism that killed him was, by 1945 medical standards, a nearly unavoidable complication of prolonged paralysis. The anticoagulant medications that would today almost certainly have prevented the fatal clot did not yet exist in clinical use. The doctors at Heidelberg did everything that could be done with the tools and knowledge available to them in 1945. He survived 12 days with a broken neck. Given the nature and severity of the injury, that was itself a significant outcome. What is also true, and worth sitting with, is that those 12 days in the hospital quietly reshaped how America remembered Patton. While he lay immobilized in Ward A1, newspapers across the country ran extended tributes to his battlefield record. The controversies, the slapping of a soldier he believed was malingering, the political clashes with Eisenhower, the provocative statements about the Soviets, and the denazification process. All of it faded from the front pages. What remained was the soldier, the man who crossed France at speed, who turned 3 divisions in winter to relieve Bastogne, who drove into the heart of Germany when everyone else said it couldn't be done that fast. A New York Times editorial published the day after his death declared that history had reached out and embraced Patton, and that his place was secure among America's greatest military leaders. The Washington Cathedral Memorial Service held in January 1946 drew 1,200 mourners. His memoir, published in 1947, became a bestseller. Buildings, streets, and squares were named after him on 2 continents. The 1970 film about his life won 7 Academy Awards and made his name known to a generation born after the war. George Patton did not die the way he had lived. There was no great final charge, no dramatic last stand, no battlefield moment worthy of the legend he had built across a lifetime of warfare. There was a hunting trip that turned into a car accident, a hospital room in Heidelberg, 12 days of paralysis, and a quiet death at dusk on the shortest day of the year. But the full story of those final weeks, the fall from Bavaria, the humiliation of the desk assignment, the morning of December 9th, the 12 days in traction with fishhooks in his cheeks, and his wife reading to him across a hospital room, the blood clot that moved silently through a body he could no longer feel. That story is not a diminishment of the man. It is, in many ways, the most human part of a life that was otherwise almost entirely larger than that. The war that had given Patton his purpose was over. The political world that followed had no use for his particular kind of bluntness. He had been pushed aside, given a ceremonial assignment, and was on his way home with his future uncertain on a cold German Sunday when an army truck made a left turn and everything changed. He survived 2 world wars and dozens of near misses with enemy fire. He was undone by a low-speed collision that no one even initially thought was serious. That is not irony in any neat literary sense. It is just the way the world works, indifferent to the size of the life it ends. He is buried in Luxembourg, facing his soldiers. His cross looks out across those of the men who died under his command during the Battle of the Bulge. He is oriented, as the historians put it, as if he is leading them again. One final time, into one final battle. He had feared irrelevance more than death. He did not get irrelevance. If you enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe to our channel so you never miss out on more history documentaries.